Tom, when were you in Upper Volta?
3 years, 1967 through 70.
We were there together for 2 years, and then you stayed on another year.
That's right. It just wasn't quite time to go home.
What do you mean? You hadn't finished your job, or?
Well, I think the first year I was there was rather difficult, adapting to a harsh environment. But I became increasingly comfortable, and I really was enjoying myself. Besides which, there was a development project that I was involved in, and I wanted to see it through.
What was the project?
Well, it was a resettlement project along one of the fertile rivers, the White Volta River, in the southeast part of the country.
Well, and you were resettling people away from the river?
Well, actually, I had worked very closely with one of the rural school teachers, Company Alexandre. We used to often get together in the evenings and talk about a lot of things, and we often dreamed, had shared common dreams about how we could get that country moving, or certainly the farmers increase their incomes. And we thought of a project involving students at a rural school, providing them with an opportunity to extend their education a couple more years beyond the normal 3-year period. And we kind of blended that idea with the notion of cultivating more fertile land than did exist around the village where we were located. Very fertile land does exist along the Volta River. So we kind of blended those ideas and developed a project and wrote up a development program, sent this particular project and the papers, this proposal, through the voie hiérarchique, as they call it, that is to say the hierarchical channels. It received the blessings of the local commandant, or the local governor of the county, and then we sent the proposal on up to Washington, Ouagadougou, the capital, where it received the blessing of people at USAID, as well as the various ministers, the Minister of Plan and the Minister of Agriculture and so forth.
And
I don't particularly care to dwell on this particular project because it proved not to be feasible in the final analysis. There was a lot of goodwill, but there is a very debilitating problem with the onchocerciasis, and that's river blindness. We were 100 miles from the capital city, and we were pretty isolated and didn't have at our command all that much information. Yes, we had heard about this river blindness problem, but we tended to mitigate it. And it really wasn't until well into my third year when I took a trip to Bobo Dioulasso, which is in the southwest part of the country, and talked to officials there at a center where they were studying this disease, that it became apparent that this was too risky of a proposition to pursue.
what is river blindness? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, there's a small black fly that burrows in human skin, usually around the ankle area, and it's not felt by the individual when he's being bitten, but when the black fly does bite the individual, it releases parasites which are transmitted into the bloodstream, and they multiply, and over the course of time they tend to concentrate in the area around the eyes, and they cause blindness. The World Bank has recognized desirability of harnessing this relatively fertile land along the rivers in Upper Volta. And since I was there, they've launched a very large project ridding the area of this black fly. So I think, in a sense, we captured potential, an idea which had a lot of merit to it in many respects. Its time had not yet arrived.
There is also a drug company that's developed a drug that can treat river blindness and pretty much arrests the development of the disease. And with the eradication in this drug, what would it look like along the White Volta if river blindness wasn't a problem?
I think the company you're talking about is Merck. Just this past year, I've read with a great deal of satisfaction that they do have this prophylactic, which I gather they're dispensing free of charge to the peasants. Well, I was in a village of about 5,000 population. The village name was Garango, and it was very densely populated around the village, and the fields were scattered about compounds, and very often a farmer had several different fields and in different parts of the surrounding territory. There's a very complex system of usufruct rights, right to land use in that area. But the lands often were not, the fields often were not contiguous, and it would have probably made more economic sense to have had one's land consolidated. But one of the reasons for the wide dispersion of land use was that certain lands were more highly prized than other lands. Those closer to the compounds where people lived obviously were preferred, and therefore the indigenous culture had evolved to the point that there was this very elaborate system of determining who could cultivate what land. But people often had to walk 20, 30 miles just to begin work in their fields, and that's very time-consuming and uses a lot of energy. So there's a high population density around the village in terms of land use. There are these fertile lands along the Volta River, and without the health problems, you'd see a migration towards those areas.
Much higher production of grain.
Much higher production of grains. Although, of course, there are problems associated with developing those lands and attracting people to the lands because there are no social amenities. I mean, it's really out in the bush. Yeah. So the transition might be a difficult one.
But water is always an issue in Upper Volta, Burkina Faso. And if there is a supply of water there year-round, they might be able to really make it a very productive area.
Oh, no doubt about it. Although those rivers do dry up in the dry season, so there's no water. Yeah. The water table is not too terribly far from the surface, though, so there are possibilities with tube well constructions of irrigating land in those areas.
It's been a long time since you were there. Maybe your memories change, but I'm curious as to what you remember the clearest about living in Upper Volta, which was very different than living here. Everything else you've experienced, I would guess.
Oh, it surely was. When I think of Upper Volta, I often smile because I often think of the very beautiful aspects of that country. There are many of them, despite the fact the climate is very harsh and there's a lot of poverty, which isn't nice to see. But there's something very gracious about the people themselves, something almost pristine. And I think that often when people are confronted with hardships, if they're not too debilitating hardships, it can be uplifting and ennobling. You often make a contrast between our society and we all do who've been to Upper Volta and Upper Volta. And we are very much consumer-oriented. We are a throwaway society. But there aren't the possibilities to consume for the average citizen in Upper Volta. And they make do with so much less and are very happy in many respects. I think that this hardship often causes them to focus on what is really important, and what is important to all human beings are personal relationships and their health. In fact, one common phrase I often heard in Upper Volta was, "La santé c'est tout." It means, if with help, that's everything. There's very little medicine, few doctors, so they don't get the kind of attention that we do in our society if they do fall ill. And then the whole concept of the family is a very important concept for the Voltaics, or I should say the people from Burkina Faso, since the country's been renamed. And by family, it's a slightly different concept than what we term family here. They refer to a family not only in terms of the nuclear unit of the father and the mother and the children, but of the extended family, which includes the larger family, those that live within a small village, and their linkages, and the small villages' linkages to the larger canton villages. And I also think very often of the graciousness that one is confronted on a daily basis. And it first was driven home to those of us who went to this area in the southeast when the governor of the county, in honor of our arrival, called 10 canton chiefs to travel, some of them 25 miles, to greet 5 of us who were in his county. That was a very gracious act, but that was the first of many. Which I'm
trying to tell people in this country about Burkina Faso, there's a lot to tell. But if you were talking to a group of people who had no idea about the country, what would be the one thing that you would want them to remember about it, or the one image that you would want them to carry away? You can't really describe to someone who hasn't been there adequately. It's really rather frustrating to try to tell someone who has not had an encounter with the culture what is so precious about that country. But those of us who've been there can relate, and there's something very beautiful indeed. And you hear diplomatic personnel, those who have had contact with the people, speak very highly of Upper Volta and that country. Very often, people believe that it's a particularly hardship post. In fact, the diplomatic personnel receive a hardship allowance because of the severe environment. But if you get to know the people, it's not a hardship post at all. It's a wonderful place to be.